In this video, we are going to talk about factoring quadratic equations into their factored form and how that can be helpful in finding the solutions to quadratic equations. How does the factored form give us these solutions? So I'm going to give an example of a quadratic equation that's been turned into its factored form. This black equation on the left is the same as the red equation on the right. It's just in its factored form. I'm not going to explain at this point how we got there. That will come next. But I just want to talk about how this factored form tells us the solutions. So the solutions are simply the opposite of the numbers in our binomial. So we have a -5 here in the first binomial. That means that one of our solutions is +5, the opposite of that. We go over to this binomial and we see a +3. That means that our other solution is -3. Remember that quadratic equations often have two solutions. That's why we're factoring it into binomials. That's why we get two numbers out of it. The solutions to x squared minus 2x minus 15 are 5 and -3. That's why we want to learn how to find this factored form. So let's get into it. The steps to factoring a quadratic equation start with understanding this basic form. We are going to have an x squared or some variable squared at the beginning. And then we're going to have the variable without any exponent and probably a coefficient in front of it. It might be a coefficient of 1. And then we are going to be adding a constant. I'm focused on the B and the C here. That's why those are colored, because those are the keys to factoring. We want to make sure that one side is equal to 0. If not, we want to get it into this form. So you might have to do a little bit of rearranging with algebra. After that, we want to find two numbers whose product is the constant C, including the sign in front of it. So if that was a -5, for instance, we'd be interested in finding two numbers whose product is -5. We want to include that sign. Now, after we find those two numbers, we want to check to see, do they add up to B? Is the sum of the two numbers that we found in the first part add up to B? If not, we need to find two more numbers. This is a process of trial and error. We're going to find there aren't only two numbers usually who will give a product of a certain number. So we try the first ones we find. If those don't work, we try two more, and we keep trying until we find the two that work. You'll see an example of that in all of our 4 examples, I think. The two numbers that match those conditions above are going to be the numbers in your binomial. The opposite of those two numbers, as we just talked about, will be the solutions to your quadratic equation. All right, let's get to those examples. Here's problem 1. We're trying to find the factored form of this quadratic equation, and then what are the solutions? So notice that the constant is +8. So step 1 is to find two numbers whose product is +8. The numbers 1 and 8, if multiplied together, give us a +8. So that works. Now we need to check step 2. Is the sum of those two numbers +6? 1 + 8 is 9. So no, that didn't work. So we have to check both of these conditions. So we need to try two more numbers. 2 and 4. Those give us +8 if we multiply 2 and 4. If we add them together, do we get 6? Yes, we do. So now we have found our two numbers, positive 2 and positive 4. It's time to put them together into the factored form. Our factored form is going to look like this. It's going to be an x in parentheses, another x in parentheses. We just have to fill in the two numbers that we're looking for. Positive 2 and positive 4. We set that equal to 0, and this is our factored form. We could multiply these two together. We could FOIL this, and we would get exactly where we started. Now, what are our solutions? It's going to be the opposite of these two numbers, negative 2 and negative 4. So that finishes up our example problem 1. Hopefully that reinforces those steps that we talked about a moment ago, but we've got 3 more examples to work through. What are the solutions and the factored form of x squared plus 3x minus 10 equals 0? So once again, we're looking for two numbers whose product is negative 10, because that's our constant right here, negative 10. Well, negative 1 and 10 will give us negative 10 if we multiply them together. Do they add up to positive 3? Negative 1 plus 10 is 9. No, they do not. We need to try again. Repeat 1 and 2 as needed until we find our solution. How about 2 and negative 5? 2 times negative 5 is negative 10. If we add those up, do we get positive 3? We get negative 3. So we're close, and that means we just need to switch the signs of these two numbers. If you get the right number but the wrong sign, just change the sign of these two numbers. Let's guess negative 2 and positive 5. Negative 2 plus positive 5 equals 3. Now we got it. Those are the two numbers. Let's put together our factored form. Those are going to go in each of our binomials, minus 2 plus 5. Hopefully you see where that comes from. And then we find our solutions. They're going to be the opposite of these, 2 and negative 5. All right, let's move on to our next problem. Same questions. What is the factored form? What are the solutions? There's a little bit of a difference in this one. X squared minus 8x equals minus 16. We can see that this is not set equal to 0. So what we need to do is to add 16 to both sides. And that's going to give us this. Now this looks more like a quadratic equation. X squared minus 8x plus 16 equals 0. And now we're going to ignore this first equation because this is really the one that we want to work on. So I'm just going to cover that up. And now we do the same steps. Two numbers whose product is plus 16. How about 2 and 8? You don't have to be too worried about finding the right ones the first time. Just pick two numbers and test it. Is the sum of those two numbers negative 8? Well, no, it's not. 2 plus 8 is 10. So that is not the right combination of numbers. Let's try another one. Negative 2 and negative 8. Negative 2 times negative 8. Whenever we multiply two negatives, we get a positive. So that's good. If we add those two numbers up, do we get negative 8? We do not. Negative 2 plus negative 8 is negative 10. So let's try two more numbers. How about negative 4 and negative 4? Negative 4 times negative 4 is positive 16. Negative 4 plus negative 4 is negative 8. That's what we were looking for. Let's put together our factored form. Once again, we start out with exactly that same format. Two parentheses, an x at the beginning of each one. We drop in our two numbers, and there we have our factored form of that equation. Now we're looking for our solutions. In this case, there's only one solution. I talked about how there is frequently, actually most of the time, there are two solutions. But in this case, there's just one. And that's because our binomials are identical. We take the opposite of -4, we get 4. We take the opposite of -4, we get 4. They are the same number. They're not two solutions anymore. There's just one. All right, one more example. What is the factored form of the quadratic equation below? What are the solutions? And once again, this one looks a little bit different than what we've seen before. What's missing here? We don't have an x term. So we should think of this like this. X squared plus 0x minus 25. Why do we need to think about it that way? It's because if we're going to follow our model for finding the factored form, we need something in front of x. We need to know that we're looking for a sum that's 0 in this case. So we kind of have to write it this way. Let's work through this process, and I think you'll see we're going to ignore that first equation and focus on this one. We need two numbers whose product is minus 25. I'll give you just a moment to think about a couple of numbers that might have that product. How about -1 and 25? That works. Try that in your calculator. Now, is the sum of those two numbers 0? No. The sum of those two numbers is 24. So let's try another one. How about -5 and 5? -5 plus 5 is 0. -5 times 5 is -25. That seems to work. So let's put together our factored form. X minus 5, x plus 5 equals 0. Now, I want to point out before we go to our solutions here that whenever the same number is in both binomials, but one's positive and one is negative, this kind of form of the quadratic equation will happen where the x term is 0. So that will cancel out that middle term, and that's why this originally looked like x squared minus 25 equals 0, because when we take the product of these two, the x part will cancel out and leave us with just a smaller equation. So this is kind of a special case of this kind of problem. Wanted to make sure you saw that. The solutions are just the opposite numbers. In this case, +5 and -5. So that wraps up this video. Now it's time for you to practice this process on your own. Good luck.